Do it live.
Let's do it live.
All
F
right.
it.
F it. Here we are.
Awesome. And we're live. So, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode. Oh, God, I can hear myself. I need to turn that off. Hi, welcome, Let me start that again. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Moviemood. I'm your host, master of movies, Alex Van Horn.
And I am John Alberto. No titles up in here today.
Yeah. John Alberto, resident movie expert, you could say.
All right. So what are we talking about today, Alex?
We're talking Martin Scorsese.
Never heard of him.
What?
Yeah.
Oh man. You gotta get Goodfellas. You gotta watch that stuff.
Oh yeah. I've heard of that one. Yeah.
That's
Okay.
a popular one.
Yeah, it's pretty popular. No, cool. But yeah, of course, Martin Scorsese. He is one of the greatest directors working today, for sure. You know, he's a national treasure. I'm a fan.
Oh yeah, me too. Do you think he's the greatest living American film director?
The greatest living American film director. Okay,
Yes.
so that probably.
He's certainly up there.
Yeah, he's got to be up there. Mm-hmm. I mean, it kind of goes back to watching, depending on it kind of goes back to what you're in the mood for, what you're in the movie mood for. But he is definitely on the Mount Rushmore.
Yeah. Who else would be on the Mount Rushmore of American film directors, do you think?
That are still living?
They're still living, yeah.
Spielberg would be up there for sure.
Yeah. George Lucas?
I don't know if George Lucas as a creator is up there, but I'm not sure as a director he's up there.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I would vote David Lynch.
That's a good one.
And Tarantino.
That's fair. Fair. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, but Scorsese is a really interesting figure because there's a lot of things to talk about. He's had a very varied career, even though his themes have been sort of similar to a lot of filmmakers, the same throughout his work, more or less. And yeah, he's an important film scholar as well as film director. Highly influential on directors of today. Directors of decades ago were influenced by him still. And it's interesting to talk about him and Steven Spielberg and together, because I think they're the only two of that generation that have lasted in Hollywood.
Right.
Like, because you have Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas and Brian De Palma, and they kind of they still make stuff, but it's not like commercial, really. It's not it doesn't feel like it's actually, a part of the Hollywood machine, if you will. It's still making content that is very, I guess, present, current, good work.
Yeah, and to that, I mean, when a Steven Spielberg movie or a Martin Scorsese movie is released, it's a premiere picture. It's an event that people, would go out of their way to see. I know I certainly do. But yeah, going back to your point about the themes, but he's certainly a diverse filmmaker. I kind of want to dive into that a little bit, because I think that a lot of people think of Martin Scorsese as the New York gangster movie guy, but and he's made some great ones, but yeah, his filmography is so much more diverse than that.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think he's tried to stray away from that in certain cases, but in other cases, like, it's awesome that he makes the movies he does, and he has that knowledge of being around gangsters, but certainly his themes usually come back to, Catholicism, certainly guilt. It plays a big part in that. Um, and the American experience. I mean, him and Spielberg are very, of course, American filmmakers.
Right. Right, for sure.
Mm.
So yeah, how do you think his filmography has evolved over time? Like from when he started making movies in maybe as early as the late 60s, but definitely through the 70s and into today.
Well, I certainly think that unlike Spielberg, I think he was kind of an outsider filmmaker, especially in the 70s and the 80s. He was certainly like well known and well liked, but he wasn't like if you think about like Mean Streets, for example, or some of his early like Roger Corman stuff, it's not, it's not Jaws or anything,
Right.
but it definitely has that like personality and the themes that are consistent with his work. Certainly New York, involving New York and gangsters and uh, violence and rock and roll. Also, a thing I really love about Scorsese is that he's a very like rock and roll oriented filmmaker. Like I don't think, probably other than maybe Michael Mann, I don't or Wes Anderson, I don't know of a more like I don't know, he just uses rock music and popular music in really interesting ways in his movies.
Right. Do you think Tarantino got that trope from him, or do you think that was something that they
For sure. Oh
yeah.
yeah, of course. And Tarantino takes a lot from Taxi Driver also,
Mhm.
and a lot of like, for instance, in Django Unchained, there's that like the little gun that pops out of the sleeve, just like Travis Bickle. And certainly, Taxi Driver is really worth talking about. I guess you could sort of think of like the phases of Scorsese's work. You kind of have like the 70s and the 80s. Well, I guess you could say like you have the 70s and then you have the 80s. And then around the 90s when Goodfellas came out, I feel like he became more commercial. And, and I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that a lot more people got to watch, like, I would bet that more people watch Gangs of New York than Mean Streets.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah. And now you have this kind of era. I mean, nowadays he's like a, presiding president of movies who, continues to make these masterpieces.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that, kind of going back to your point about Spielberg and Scorsese continuing to make movies, is that Scorsese in particular, his movies from the 2010s are just as good
Oh
as
yeah.
those early works.
Hmm.
They're He's made some really impressive things this decade.
Yeah, and certainly he's gotten better and he's adapted to the the technology and the style of each decade. For example, he started using digital stuff and The Wolf of Wall Street. Um, yeah, so he seems to be continually adapting. And The Irishman, of course, with the them redoing, making
Was
Joe Pesci younger.
Yeah. Was The Wolf of Wall Street his first digital movie?
I wouldn't. I mean, I heard it was, but I wouldn't. I wouldn't. I couldn't tell you for sure.
Yeah, because
I know he did use it for The Wolf of Wall Street.
gotcha. Because I think back, it's interesting because I think back to Hugo, which he did maybe a
That's
year before
right.
The Wolf
Yeah.
of Wall Street, which is uh, technically pretty marvelous, but in and of itself, it seems like it's a love letter to film, not necessarily like movie making as a whole to an extent, but actual film as well.
Yeah. What, Hugo?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And that's a movie that kind of gets I always forget about, but it's so good. Like it's his kids movie. That's it's awesome.
Right. And it's and that's one of the things about his filmography is it's you know, so diverse. It's not just, you know, your Taxi Drivers, Raging Bull, Goodfellas. It's
Mm-hmm.
you've got your movies like Hugo, you
Hugo,
Islands,
Shutter Island.
After Hours, Shutter Island for sure.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
which one do you want to talk about? Because like I feel like we could do a whole podcast on Goodfellas, but we could certainly divert. What was the first Martin Scorsese movie you watched?
Actually, The Aviator.
I could have guessed that.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was your reaction when you first saw it?
I I was probably only like 12 years old, but I loved that movie.
Yeah.
It's still one of my favorite movies. I remember just reading up on it and the different things that he did based on the different filming methods he used in that movie based on the different decades of Howard Hughes's life. I like the colors that he used and the filming methods. It was really kind of cool and interesting. But yeah, that was the first one I saw. What about you?
Um, I saw The Departed actually, and I
Okay.
think I saw it when I was 11 or 12, and it was like certainly like uh thematically and also it was R and I saw it and it just kind of blew my mind about like what movies were and what movies could be.
Did
And
you
certainly like
I'm sorry, did
go
you see
ahead.
The Departed in theaters or did you see it at home?
I saw it at home. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
Mhm. And yeah, it's still one of my favorite um Martin Scorsese movies. But I remember reading when it came out and it won all the Oscars. I think Ebert was like, it's like giving the Pulitzer Prize to Cormac McCarthy's The Road when you had all this other stuff that he could have gotten it for. It was kind of like he could have got best director for Goodfellas, Raging Bull, Taxi Driver, um, all these other films. But certainly Departed is no less a good movie. It's fantastic.
Yeah, The Departed is spectacular. It's amazing, and it's one of Jack Nicholson's last roles, and Jack Nicholson is my favorite actor. So
Oh
seeing
yeah,
him in a Scorsese movie and seeing Leonardo DiCaprio develop as an actor, from a
for
child star
sure.
to the late '90s, the romances to working very closely with Scorsese. It's amazing how he's really able to develop people around him as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
certainly with like he with working with Christopher Nolan and Tarantino. He's a great actor. I liked what you said about The Aviator and the use of like cinematography, and he's very like even though his films are super realistic, they're still like movies, and he still goes out of his way to do these crazy angles and do these like there are shots in The Aviator that are like you know um, split screen
Right. Yep.
and just some really dynamic filmmaking.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Um, and and that seems like it's something that he's always kind of experienced. He's always kind of experimented with. I mean, and
Yeah,
you look back to, I think, when a lot of people think of two quintessential gangster movies, if you will, they think of The Godfather, or they think of Goodfellas.
mm-hmm.
And and while I think, me personally, I probably like the story of The Godfather the better.
Mm-hmm.
His filming methods for Goodfellas and like the way he
Yeah,
told the story was kind of what differentiates it.
yeah, and it's definitely a more realistic story, but also you get like the language of the narrator, and yeah, oh my gosh, we could just talk about Goodfellas for a while. Yeah, Goodfellas I think was maybe the next movie I watched after The Departed, and it also just kind of blew my mind, and I still notice new things when I see it.
Mhm.
Um, one scene I was just watching was the last day as a wise guy scene. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's amazing stuff.
Yeah. it's funny because like in Goodfellas, there are definitely a lot of scenes that we come back to, and
Hmm.
it's not necessarily famous scenes. Like one of the ones I frequently come back to is when they're in the is when they're in prison and they're making pasta sauce together.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's not anything special. It's just narrating how to make pasta sauce, but the way that
Keep stirring it.
yeah, the way that it's presented and his craft is special. So
Yeah, there's the Billy Bats scene, is that his name? Where Joe Pesci kills a guy, and then there's also the scene where they are trying to get rid of the body, and they go to um Joe Pesci's mom's house, and they have dinner, and she's played by Scorsese's mom, and she's like showing them a picture, and yeah, that's a fantastic scene.
yeah,
Also, when they're
yeah.
like talking about like chopping up a deer, like the hoof, it's called the hoof.
So do you think do you think it was kind of underlooked for Best Picture that year? It lost out to Dances with Wolves.
Oh yeah, forget Dances with Wolves. I mean,
Yeah,
I think I've seen that movie one time, but I mean, yeah, that movie is kind of, yeah, it's okay.
yeah, peak of Kevin Costner's career. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting, kind of looking looking at his career and looking at the recognition he's received. Because I would argue that throughout my entire life, he's certainly been revered, but
Yeah.
he didn't really get recognition from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences till The Departed,
Yeah.
and he's made some spectacular things. He's made Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, The Aviator, Goodfellas, and he didn't. He may have been nominated, but he didn't get the ultimate recognition. So
I feel like the reason that is because certainly his films now are difficult and deal with difficult subject matter, but like Taxi Driver and Raging Bull are hard to watch. They're rough, and they're great movies, but I could certainly see like the Academy kind of being like, oh, like we should give it to like Ordinary People or Dances with Wolves because this is like a lot.
yeah. Now, one of them that's really tough for me to debate whether I agree with the Academy or not is Taxi Driver versus Rocky.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, Rocky
Rocky,
is,
Rocky,
yeah,
Rocky kind of swept that year, and
that's right.
I have a special place in my heart for Rocky,
Mm,
but I mean, Taxi Driver's Taxi Driver too, So
yeah, and Taxi Driver is really interesting because it's an odd movie, but certainly watching it several times, you kind of like get these other layers. Like I think I didn't realize how much of a movie about race it is.
mm,
Um, like I think the first time I watched it, I was just like, oh, it's about this like vigilante guy who is pretty weird and pretty gross. But then the second time you see it, you're like, oh, he's pretty racist, and like you just kind of notice all these things about him, like new sort of ticks. And I think he's just really good at character study films.
yeah,
Like
I
he,
think
yeah,
character study films for sure is something that he excels at. Even in kind of his sprawling epic films, it ultimately comes down to a study of an individual character and why they are the way they are. I mean, I think about Silence, and I think about the
yeah,
differences between Andrew Garfield and Adam
Liam
Driver in
Neeson.
that movie.
Yeah, yeah, Driver. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's true. Yeah, and we were also the only two people that saw
in the
Silence
world who saw
in
it.
the world. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure no one went to go see that movie.
No, Silent. It's good. Did
Yeah,
you end up rewatching it?
no, but I have it on Blu-ray now, so I will eventually.
Okay.
Just because I love I love Martin Scorsese and I love Japan, and so I definitely would like to watch it again, and notice new things. And Adam Driver and Andrew Garfield, fantastic actors.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Liam Neeson. But it's a rough one. I mean, it's with Raging Bull and his other movies that are really, um, yeah, very brutal
Hmm.
character studies. I think. Um, yeah, and I'm glad you watched After Hours.
Yeah, I enjoyed After Hours tremendously.
Yeah,
It's kind of a nightmarish look at nightlife in New York City, I guess. But it's the second Griffin Dunn movie I've seen. The lead actor,
yeah.
and
Griffin Dunn's fantastic.
I just realized I want more Griffin Dunn in my life.
Yeah,
He's he's awesome.
yeah. I think he did like a Joan Didion documentary because I think he's related to. I think he's like Joan Didion is his aunt. She was like a writer,
Mhm.
um, from California, and yeah. Well, American Werewolf and After Hours are pretty fantastic, and that kind of like also at the same time highlights Scorsese's pretty funny.
He's
Like,
incredibly funny.
yeah, his movies are hilarious. I mean, even if they have these like really hard to deal with subjects, and there's still humor, and you can still kind of laugh at his characters or with his characters. Um, yeah,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, really, really, the only movie where I don't think I actively found any humor at
yeah,
all was Silence. But other than that,
yeah. I'll have to watch it
there's
again because I read something where there was like a funny part, and I was like,
is there
"What
okay.
part?" Like the part when
I
he's being tortured. There's
I
like a
will
funny
admit
part there. I don't know.
I will admit I only watched Silence once, and I don't think I can.
Yeah,
I don't think it's one that I can sit down and pop into my laptop and watch. I had to actively go to the theater to watch that. So
yeah.
yeah,
It's a rough one for
yeah,
sure. But After Hours is good. I just like how I don't know. It just seems like very freewheeling Scorsese. Like it's not about a historical epic. It's not about like really like it's not like something intense like uh Taxi Driver, but it's somewhere in the middle, and it's just like about this guy who's just going through hell, and yeah, it's hilarious. Great movie,
it's very very funny.
very underrated too.
Yeah, and I had never heard of it until you recommended it to me. But even though to your point, it's not a sprawling American epic or even really a character study about Griffin Dunn. It's you can and it's a very short movie too. It's only like an hour and a half. You can still tell it's Martin Scorsese behind the camera just
Yeah,
based on the way
you still
he
got those wild cameras going in and out, and super fast cuts and rock music.
right for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What did you think of Last Temptation?
Um, it was interesting. Um,
Yeah.
I know I may have brought this up, but I bought into Willem Dafoe as Jesus. Um, Harvey Keitel, great actor.
Yeah.
I was not bought into
No.
to his Judas, and that's okay. It was it was as bad as it sounds. It was kind of a fun watch.
I
Like,
know. I know
yeah,
that it's actually the same thing for me as well. And like I guess when it came out, a lot of people were like offended by
yeah,
it because it was like this is not a Jesus movie. And it's like, oh, it's just like a Martin Scorsese movie, but Jesus happens to be the main character.
right,
Yeah.
yeah,
And like David Bowie's in it.
yes, as pilot.
Yeah, he's like, I don't understand you. And it's pretty goofy. But it's got some amazing stuff. I mean, it's really, yeah, it's well made.
Yeah, it's definitely well made, and um, I I like how a lot of it is told through dreams instead of through
Yeah, it's
the
very trippy.
actual. Yeah, it's very trippy versus just the standard passion play that we often get with biblical epics.
That it has to be my one of my top two Jesus movies.
Yeah, I'm pretty big on Jesus Christ Superstar myself. I don't know if you,
Yeah, I actually haven't seen it, but I've heard it's really good.
it's pretty rock and roll to your
Yeah,
point. Yeah. So
that's what I'm about. Yeah, I like going back to rock and roll. Uh, one thing that I really like about that sequence from Goodfellas, the last day as a wise guy, is that that entire sequence is timed to the first song that plays, which is the Harry Nielsen "Jump Into the Fire," and it like changes songs, but it still keeps the beat of
nice.
that. Yeah, and so you can like play that song throughout, and it still matches up. And I don't know, it's just amazing. Like it's just going, it's just following his like him being coked up and running around and seeing helicopters and
Yeah, I'll have to rewatch. I'll have to rewatch Goodfellas because I mean I've seen it. I've seen Goodfellas multiple times, but it has been a few years since
yeah,
I last
me
watched
too,
it. So
me too. Yeah, gotta
I need
watch it
to check
every
it out.
year.
Yep, yep, for sure. It's
So there's a
yeah.
lot. There's a lot to talk about. Also, I was watching this thing about his like film foundation um, thing, and he's really big into um, like refurbishing old films and fixing them up and making them look nice. And there are these filmmakers. I don't know if you've heard of them, Powell and Pressburger, um, British filmmakers from well, British and German filmmakers from the 40s and 50s. But if you watch their stuff, you're like, whoa, there's like everything Martin Scorsese with these filmmakers. Like you
Really
have the vibrant colors and the dynamic camera, but also kind of the realistic story. And yeah, they're like really influential on him. But
interesting.
they're really worth watching, especially Colonel Blimp and Black Narcissus.
Okay, well
Yeah.
I will put those on my watch list.
Yeah, I don't want to add more to your watch list. You
No,
already have
I have a
enough.
growing watch list.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
do I. Never ends.
yeah. Um, hmm. So so The Departed was the first Martin Scorsese movie you saw. Which one, besides Goodfellas, do you think impacted you most from a from someone interested in the filmmaking process, someone interested in screenwriting, someone interested in the actual
Yeah,
process of movie making?
it's a lot. It's hard to say. I mean, Goodfellas certainly, Taxi Driver certainly, Taxi Driver almost for like the movies that it comes from, like the movies where it comes from, and then also the movies that kind of tried to be like Taxi Driver, like Drive, um, certainly some Michael
Joker.
Mann movies. Joker, oh my gosh, yeah, Joker. Yeah, Joker is like was like kind of a wannabe Scorsese movie in a lot of
Yeah,
ways,
I picked up on
yeah, which is fine. That's fine.
that. Yeah.
Can do that.
Also pretty heavily influenced by the King of Comedy, which is
Yeah, that's true. Yep,
that's kind of an underlooked Scorsese movie as well.
it
Yeah.
is. Yeah, it's kind of like funny Taxi Driver.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I rewatched it again. I didn't like it as much as I liked it the first time, but I still like it. It still has that like really raw sense of humor. Um, yeah, it's pretty good, and it definitely spoofs the talk shows and celebrity culture, and yeah.
Right. So
Oh, Casino.
I didn't see it.
Oh,
Is it worth the watch, Alex?
yes, it is
Okay.
worth the watch. Yeah,
Okay.
I think I've seen all the Scorsese movies except for New York, and Kundun.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. New York is already on my watch list.
yeah.
So
It
um,
sounds interesting. I haven't seen it yet.
that's one of his earlier movies for sure.
Yeah.
But
But yeah, Casino is good. It's kind of like sort of like how The Irishman kind of follows Casino and Goodfellas. Casino's kind of in there and is very similar to those movies, but it's it's also wacky and a good time.
right. Yeah. And it was one of the It was really cool. Prior prior to The Irishman, was that the last movie that he had made with Robert De Niro?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, which
Okay.
is a while. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I
like
mean, it came out in the
15
mid
years.
'90s,
Yeah,
so 25 years.
yeah.
But
And he certainly has worked with De Niro a lot.
yeah, and that's the thing is I'll say it bluntly, his movies are great, and comes back to it comes back to his screenplays, it comes back to his cinematography, his filming, and the performances. And early in his career, he collaborated frequently with Robert De Niro, of course, into the '90s, and now he collaborates pretty frequently with Leonardo DiCaprio. And
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. So, what do you think? Let's go through the decades.
okay.
What do you think is his best movie of the 2010s?
The 2010s, I would have to go with The Wolf of Wall Street.
Yeah,
I think,
I'm on the fence of with. Hmm, I think I'm on the fence there. That and The Irishman. I really like The Irishman.
yeah, and again, I know we've brought this up before, but you had the opportunity to see The Irishman in theaters,
Mhm. Yeah,
so so I think you probably have a little bit of a different perspective on it than I do.
for
But
sure.
do you and can I ask you, do you think a lot of the appeal of the Irishman is nostalgia, or do you think it's one of his great movies?
I think it's a little of both
Okay.
because I think it actually does come from a different perspective. It definitely is like a film made by an older person. Like it's not and it's still dynamic and like does all these crazy things with the camera and um but I think that it feels old. It feels like a movie about someone getting old, and certainly Scorsese is in his you know 70s now. Yeah,
Yeah, he was born in 42.
yeah, and
Yep.
so it just feels like it's kind of like a perspective on like Goodfellas is kind of like the perspective on a life from like somebody in their 40s or in their 50s. Casino is sort of like the same thing, and then The Irishman is kind of like looking back. And a friend of mine said that, and I don't agree with him, but he said that the only good part, the only new part about it that Scorsese hadn't dealt with was the last 30 minutes of the movie,
Mhm.
which kind of makes sense. It kind of is all leading up to that. It's certainly a pretty realistic portrayal of like what old age is like. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I think I mean, I felt like it kind of went into some new territory. One because Al Pacino's in it,
Yeah,
and they've
yeah.
never worked together.
And in my opinion, Al Pacino is the best part of the movie.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would argue for me, it's between Al Pacino and Joe Pesci
Okay.
because Al Pacino is like at his best. He's like, doing what Al Pacino does best, just being, loud and funny and maybe annoying.
Right.
But yeah, I just love him in that movie. And like,
Yeah.
I was cracking up in the theater. And then you have Joe Pesci, who hasn't really been in a lot of movies. And if you think about Joe Pesci, like in a lot of his big films, he's pretty, all over the place, energetic, and certainly that role is new for Al Pacino. Oh no, Joe Pesci. It's more like subtle, and it's like a less is more sort of thing. So if you like
That's
watch
a great
them,
point.
yeah. So if you watch them, especially the scenes where they're talking, it's like somebody who's oblivious and somebody who like knows everything, you know.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, and I think one of the things that some people kind of can overlook with Scorsese is the technical marvel of his films, and the de aging process that they used on De Niro, Pacino, and Pesci was pretty incredible as well.
Yeah, it's pretty weird. I don't know if I if I totally bought it, but I was like, okay. So
So I actually did, and like I compare it to, other things that have been done in other movies, not necessarily de-aging,
mhm,
but I think back to, just a few years ago,
Avatar.
Rogue One, a Star Wars story, and they
Oh
and
yeah,
they put Peter Cushing in the movie and young Carrie Fisher in the movie, and it
yeah.
it was not convincing,
You're right.
um, versus I felt like I was watching, not young but upper middle aged, Al Pacino, Joe Pesci, and Robert De Niro versus you know very late 70s, early 80s. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and I think I could tell that it was of course it was they're being digitized, but yeah, I kind of bought it. Like I was with it. I was like, okay, so that's that. But I could still tell that they were there acting and performing the role. Um, so I could there's like reasonable disbelief. There's some like funny lines in The Irishman that I like also like at the very beginning, like Robert De Niro is like doing shots and this guy's like, drink up, it's a bar. Like
right,
it's just like an absurd like, thing that people would say in a Scorsese movie.
sure.
Um but I don't know, like at the same time it is kind of a nostalgic thing. Like I'm a big Scorsese fan, so obviously I enjoyed it.
Yeah, and I think that's to his credit, because it's I I kind of led you into that question because it is a little bit of both. It is a little bit of nostalgia, but it's also terrific.
Yeah.
So I mean, and I'm looking at the movies that he made in the 2010s. He's made Shutter Island, Hugo, The Wolf of Wall Street, Silence,
Right.
and The Irishman, and
I mean, those are all fantastic.
yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I would also say like I had a phase where I really loved Shutter Island, um, and it's certainly a fascinating film of his.
Yeah, it's great. I actually rewatched Shutter Island very recently, and it still stands up. It's a good character study. It's
Yeah.
the score is incredible. It's not rock and roll, but
No,
but
it's certainly evocative.
yes,
It's not subtle.
no, it's not subtle at all. And I think that's one of the fun things about Scorsese is if there is one word that I would absolutely not use to describe him, it would be subtle.
I was thinking about that when I was driving over. I think he is subtle in
How
some
so?
ways. Um, I think that in Taxi Driver, with the racism that's in it, I think that is subtle,
Okay,
unless you are aware of that going on. Like for some people who may watch it, you may miss that. And also, I think he's not necessarily like a political filmmaker, but there's certainly like political things that are in it, but it doesn't take over the story like a Oliver Stone or um, uh, sometimes Spike Lee. It
sure,
doesn't take over the story. It is in the story, but it doesn't like it's not a strong commentary, but it's not subtle in other areas, like his camera movements, the music.
sure.
But I think it's to certain degrees he is subtle.
Okay.
But um, yeah, that's yeah. What do you think about that?
So yeah, it's interesting because, like, to your point about Taxi Driver, I didn't watch Taxi Driver in 1976. I
Right.
watched it in probably 2009 was the first time I saw Taxi Driver.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of times with movie making as a whole, you kind of like events of the world, like crime in New York City
Inform
in the
it.
70s
Yeah.
was certainly issue that was talked about frequently in the 70s, but in
Mhm.
2009 I didn't know that. So when I watch some of his older movies versus, some of his more recent movies, I think it's kind of easier for me to kind of compare, what's going on in the movies that were released in the 2010s to what's actually going on in the 2010s versus,
Yeah.
looking back at
Yeah,
the
because
70s.
certainly The Irishman and The Wolf of Wall Street are, even though The Irishman is back in the day, it still seems to be commenting on nowadays and what's going on. Yeah, in subtle ways though. Like Jimmy Hoffa is like, having these rallies basically,
Hmm.
um, which I think was kind of interesting.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, I have a question to posit to you about Shutter Island.
sure.
So I love Shutter Island, um, but I think that one thing about it is that I think could have been different in the hands of a different filmmaker. Do you think that the character study over is stronger than like the thriller aspect of it, like as like a Hitchcockian gothic sort of thing? Like, like imagine if David Fincher directed Shutter Island. Do you think it would be? How do you think it would be different?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that Shutter Island ultimately comes down to the character study.
Yeah,
It's a it's certainly a psychological thriller film. Like that is the genre of film that I would put it in. But it's not it's not about what's going on the island. It's about what's going on in Teddy Daniels' head,
yeah,
and that's what and it's
or whoever his
and
name
and
is.
and largely it's because a lot of that story is told in flashbacks to what happened in the war, what happened in his home life, from his perspective. And um, I think David Fincher is a director who I love. I think David Fincher is a phenomenal director, but I think he would have kind of presented it from more of a psychological, like a pure psychological thriller perspective, like
Yeah,
what is going on in this island. It's more about what is going on in the environment around versus what's going on within.
yeah, and I think in a lot of Shutter Island, it doesn't really focus on, like, I guess if M Night Shyamalan directed Shutter Island, it would be more about like what's going on the island and all the twists in the plot. Like that would be more about it. But in the hands of Scorsese, is kind of like it's more about the character, like what's going on, and you can kind of guess the plot points a little bit, but it's still interesting to watch because of the character study.
Right. And because ultimately, not spoiling the movie, but it comes down to what's going on with Teddy Daniels in the plot of this movie.
Yeah,
So it's Shutter Island's great.
yeah.
Go see
I gotta
Shutter Island.
rewatch it. It's
Yeah.
awesome. It's so good,
Um,
man.
and that cast too. I mean,
Yeah,
Leonardo DiCaprio, Mark Ruffalo, Michelle Williams. Um,
yeah.
it's,
Super, super great actors. Yeah,
yeah.
and definitely like in his later career, he's consistently had like the best cast.
Well,
Like
I
The
think
Departed is insane.
I think people want to work with Martin Scorsese for
Yeah,
sure,
definitely.
and rightfully so. I mean, going back to the point about Robert De Niro and Leonardo DiCaprio, seeing them develop into some of the greatest actors of their era and knowing the relationship that they have with Martin Scorsese, why wouldn't somebody want to work with Martin Scorsese?
Yeah, it seems like all of his like aspects of filmmaking are always on point. What do you think is his best movie of the 2000s.
For me, it's The Aviator.
Yeah.
It really is. I think the fact that The Aviator was not recognized as the best picture of 2004 was a travesty. It was a
What got that for 2004?
$1 million baby.
Oh, yeah. Aviator is better. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, I I love The Aviator. And looking at his filmography from the 2000s, looks like he made four movies: Gangs of New York, The Aviator, and no, he only made three movies in the 2000s. He made
Oh
Gangs of
wow.
New York, The Aviator, and The Departed.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
and
Gangs of New York is an interesting movie.
yeah, Gangs
I
of
I don't think it's my I think it's actually might be one of my least favorite. I mean, it's certainly fun, but it's not like the one. I don't know. It's not my fave.
I agree with you strongly on that. It's one of his epics. And you get a really fun performance out of Daniel Day Lewis in it, but
Oh
it's
yeah.
not. And it was nominated for a ton of Academy Awards. It did not win any, but it was nominated for a ton, like 10 or 11. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think the 2000s ultimately comes down to either The Aviator or The Departed. For me, it's
For
The
sure.
Aviator. What would it be for you?
The Departed. Yeah. I mean, I do really love The Aviator and I like Gangs of New York, but yeah, The Departed is big for me. That's a big movie. Um, and it certainly has that like the use of rock music with that one
Dropkick
song
Murphys, yeah, yeah,
shipping up to Boston.
yep.
And it kind of like fits in with those like Boston movies like Manchester by the Sea that are yeah, Oscar winners and um, certainly are have a lot of things going on. Jack Nicholson's great performance. Also one of his the better scripts I think that he's had,
Oh, I think so
at least
too.
plot wise.
Yeah, and I think kind of to that point, like his movies, all of his movies obviously have plots, but I think about a lot of his movies. I think about, Goodfellas. I think about The Last Temptation of Christ. Sometimes things sort of meander, and
Yeah,
that's one of the really ultimately it's one of the really appealing things about him is that
yeah,
he can kind of meander along, and it works because of the way he presents his movies. But to your point, The Departed just locked in on the story, the script.
yeah.
It's great. It
And
works. It
it's
works as
I
well.
think it's going back to like his character studies. I think that's why he can meander because like the narrator's voice is just like, oh, then I was doing this, da, 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 and then I went and did this. And in The Departed, you have so many. It follows Matt Damon's character, Leo's character, and it's more yeah more plot driven.
Yeah, they have a lot to do in 2.5 hours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I mean, you
Um.
have
Yeah.
go ahead.
I was gonna say there's a tidbit I was thinking about for Gangs of New York. I believe it was produced by the Weinsteins,
Mm-hmm.
and apparently they clashed.
Oh,
The
really?
Weinsteins and Scorsese, yeah. And Scorsese, I believe, has something of a temper, and the Weinsteins for sure had uh, their temper tantrums at people. But apparently, like a lot of it, like the reason it wasn't as good was because of the Weinsteins.
Interesting. Like,
They changed stuff, and also probably why it was nominated for so many Oscars. Um,
that's a good point.
yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah,
what about
I'm looking at the poster of Gangs of New York right now, and
yeah?
it doesn't look like the poster of a Scorsese movie. It has like a
No.
tagline on it: "America was born in the streets." And
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't look like. Yeah. I don't know. Period picture. Martin Scorsese is not. Well, I mean, I guess Goodfellas kind of is in a way.
well, I mean, he does have a few period pieces, if you will. I mean, not that the period is point, but think about Silence, think about Last Temptation of
Oh,
Christ,
true.
even
Yeah.
even The Aviator.
Yeah. He certainly seemed to do more of that as he went along.
Yeah,
I guess his best movie of the '90s is probably Goodfellas.
I would
I
think,
forgot.
I would certainly think so.
Yeah, for sure. I
Yeah.
forgot about The Age of Innocence and Cape Fear.
hmm
Have you seen those ones?
I've seen bits of Cape Fear. I have not seen The Age of Innocence.
Yeah, Age of Innocence is worth watching. I would probably have to watch it again to appreciate it. Cape Fear is wacky. Oh man,
Yeah,
it's wild.
it is wild. Um, Nick Nolte, Robert De Niro. Yeah,
Yeah, crazy Robert De Niro,
yeah,
terrifying.
yeah. He
It's a
makes
good
some
one.
psychological thrillers. That's definitely one of them.
Man,
So
he can get into the mind of the madness of somebody.
yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
And how
Um,
about the '80s? What do you think?
so let's see. Looking at the '80s, we've got Raging
Raging
Bull, The King of
Bull.
Comedy, After Hours, The Color of Money, the Last Temptation of Christ, and then New York Stories, which I have not seen. I've not seen New York
I
Story.
I'm
Oh,
gonna say I do really like Raging Bull, but I'm gonna say After Hours.
I'm gonna say
Actually,
After Hours too, man.
After Hours is so good. Oh
I,
my
yeah. If there's anything to take away, it's go watch After Hours.
yeah, please.
It is funny. It's entertaining.
Crazy,
Uh,
entertaining.
the dialogue's witty. This poor man and the night he's having.
No,
Yeah,
yeah, he is a rough time,
just trying to get home.
but yeah, that's it. It's just a guy trying to get home.
And I think
Almost, like North by Northwest, I guess. It's just all these things just keep happening to this
right.
guy.
And I think everybody can kind of relate to that. I mean, obviously not to the extent that it's shown in the movie, but
Yeah,
everybody can relate to like, oh, you just want to do this simple thing and
yeah,
everything is falling apart around you.
for sure.
Yeah.
It's so good. And Raging Bull, I think certainly, I mean, it's generally accepted as like one of his greatest movies, but it's very rough. I mean, it's very hard to watch.
It is a rough watch.
Yeah,
It's a tough watch. And, you know, people oftentimes list it as a sports film and call it one of the greatest sports films of all time. It's not a sports
it's
film.
not about sports.
It's there is boxing in it.
It's about
Um,
toxic masculinity.
Jake LaMotta is a boxer, but yeah, it's about toxic masculinity for sure.
Yep.
And it's about this man and his family and the
Everything they go through.
the terrible life that they have, even though they probably have a lot of wealth.
I think that was Joe Pesci's first Scorsese movie.
Was it?
Also.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And Pesci's definitely interesting. He's like a fascinating person.
Pesci's a great actor. I think kind of going back to the point of a movie like The Irishman and seeing Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, and Joe Pesci together.
Yeah.
It's exciting to watch because I think when you look at a lot of Joe Pesci's movies, you see the comedy aspect of him.
Yeah.
You've got Home Alone, you've got even in Goodfellas.
That's right. Home
Alone.
Alone.
You've got My Cousin Vinny, and even in Goodfellas, he's completely psychotic, but he's funny.
He's funny.
Yeah, he's
Terrifying but funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. In The Irishman, he's mainly just like quiet and kind of terrifying.
Right.
But I mean, it's interesting. Like I was thinking about that movie. He just looks like an old, like withered cat in The Irishman.
In The Irishman, yeah.
Like you won't want to mess with him, but he's like not gonna move.
Right.
Yeah, you won't want to get in his territory.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, Joe Pesci's a treasure for sure.
Yeah.
Um,
And so, what about the '70s?
all right, so
I
I
mean, I'm thinking Taxi Driver.
Yeah, looking at his filmography, I've only seen one of his movies from the '70s, and that's Taxi Driver.
Ooh,
I have
and
not seen Mean Streets or New York, New York,
where
or
Alice doesn't live here anymore.
Boxcar Bertha.
All
Yeah,
good ones, all worth watching.
yeah.
Um,
New York, New York, and Mean Streets are already on my watch list. But
yeah, Mean Streets is interesting. It's kind of like it's kind of like I guess like yeah, Goodfellas, but younger. And it's certainly like I think he got better at like his style. Like I think it's still kind of like being developed in Mean Streets, but it's still good. It still has that like kinetic thing going on. And it's about New York in the '70s, which is like the most fascinating place. So
right
so interesting.
now, kind of segueing away from the decades, but when I look back at the podcast we did about um, the Coen brothers, they obviously
Yeah,
write a lot of their own movies. But I'm looking through Martin Scorsese's filmography, and he's written a couple of his movies, but largely, largely, you know, he collaborates with different screenwriters.
yeah.
Um, so, do you think that benefits him as a filmmaker, or do you think that hinders him? Do you think that he would be he would be better if he were the writer of his movies as well?
I'm not sure. I mean, he's certainly like he seems like very focused on the
Right.
film aspect of it, but he's worked with some great writers. I mean, Paul Schrader, who, uh, dude, have you seen First Reformed?
I have. Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah,
have.
the movie's wild.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that movie, like, when you're watching it, you can be like, oh yeah, this is Paul Schrader. Like, this is the guy who did Taxi Driver. Like, it just makes sense. I don't know. I think it benefits, especially its collaboration with Paul Schrader. I think was fantastic. Um, yeah, I mean, it makes for like a varied career. I feel like.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree strongly with that. I think that seeing Martin Scorsese as a collaborator is one of the best things about him. Going back to what we see on screen with the actors that he frequently works with, to different writers, I think one of the things that I love about the movie making process is it's really cool to see the movie with the director, the writer, and the actor all the same person, because it's really cool to see someone's passion project.
yeah,
But at the same time, one of my favorite aspects of movie making is the collaborative effort.
sure.
Seeing a screenwriter's vision, a director's vision, a cinematographer's vision, and an actor's vision all come together.
Yeah,
Yeah. And then
yeah,
having the support of a studio to make it work. I think,
yeah.
yeah.
And that's like that's definitely the best case scenario for a movie is that you have all those things come together um, perfectly. And then also the music, the
Yeah,
soundtrack
of course.
frequently
Yeah.
has, the Rolling Stones, Give Me Shelter, the song Give Me Shelter. Yeah, the collaborative aspect is something that sometimes we forget about, especially when we're talking about a director's work, because we could certainly talk about De Niro's work, and we could talk about Al Pacino's work, and we could probably talk about Paul Schrader's work. I mean, he was the writer for most of Scorsese's movies in like the first half of his career.
Mhm.
Certainly affected his work. I think his movies maybe are less edgy now that Paul Schrader is not his writer. But yeah, but that doesn't make it bad. I think he's he's still amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
works with the best people.
The Wolf of Wall Street's pretty edgy.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know, but it's not like hard to watch like Raging Bull is.
Right.
Yeah, Raging Bull is great, but it's well, yeah. There's definitely some rough patches in The Wolf of Wall Street. Um, but I don't know. I felt like it was also very like very fun in a way, like watching these people being so hedonistic, you know.
Yeah. Now, do you have any knowledge on what it's like to work on a Scorsese set? I mean, I think about, you know, I think back to, Stanley Kubrick as a director and it being, hell on the set. Like I think about The Shining and Shelley Duvall and, doing hundreds of different takes. With Martin Scorsese, do you think it's more of a, I mean, obviously they're there to work and produce something, but do you think it's more of a fun environment, or do you have any knowledge on that?
I heard something like it seems like it's probably fun if you're working hard. Like if you're actually like doing work, then you're gonna have fun. And like I mean, you'd have to be at like your the top of your game, you know, if you're even like a grip or like a lighting designer, like you
Right.
know, there's no messing around. But I feel like for his actors and maybe even for other collaborators, I mean, once they get that thing that they need to do, he seems to be very like playful, like especially with his actors and improv. Just thinking about all those scenes with Al Pacino, like I think easily like somebody like Al Pacino could have dialed it in and kind of done like his whatever his thing, but you could obviously see that he was, you know, stepping into new territory and uh, still being classic Al, you know.
Sure, for sure.
Yeah.
Uh, Al Pacino. We'll have to talk about him one day.
No,
Yeah.
he's one of my faves.
Yep.
And Nicolas Cage, of course.
Naturally.
But yeah, I don't know. It's probably pretty hard to be on a Scorsese set. To be honest, it's probably a lot of work. But um,
and there's all the prestige of being on a Scorsese set too.
yeah,
You know.
he's huge. He's a big name.
Yep. On the Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Him, David Lynch, the Coen
Spielberg.
brothers, Spielberg,
Yeah. Tarantino.
Tarantino. Yep, that's a
Yeah.
good list. And then like George Lucas, maybe.
Yep. But so ultimately, if someone had never seen a Martin Scorsese movie before, which one would you have them watch?
Uh, definitely. I mean, for me, I'd say Goodfellas and The Departed, or Goodfellas and The Aviator, or I mean, if they're ready, Taxi Driver, because yeah, there's certain. I mean, there are different aspects of his filmmaking. Um, he's a very varied director,
Sure.
and certainly you could watch Hugo, but you wouldn't get like, you know, you wouldn't see him doing like something like After Hours uh,
Right. Right.
in like 70s New York. So yeah, I'd probably say Goodfellas, The
Okay.
Departed. I mean, watch the classics.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you,
See, I think for me, I would take a different approach, especially with a working director. Um,
oh yeah,
if I were to recommend somebody to start, I would recommend with starting with the movies that came out in their lifetime, so that they could get an understanding of like what was
yeah,
going on in the world when they were when they started this movie. So, I think to kind of get a perspective on the way that what a typical Martin Scorsese movie might look like. Not that there really is a typical Martin Scorsese movie. I would start with the Wolf of Wall Street,
yeah,
work my way back to Goodfellas, and then kind of go into that very very heavy stuff of the '70s and early '80s, Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, all of that.
yeah. And
Yeah.
certainly, yeah, Wolf of Wall Street is like, yeah, it kind of takes from that Goodfellas thing and goes into a different direction.
Hmm.
But yeah, that would be a good. I mean, it's a very watchable 3 hours.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, we could go on for like another hour talking about Martin Scorsese, but I think that wraps it up.
I think so.
But I didn't mention The Last Waltz. great concert movie, also worth watching.
Right. And him as a documentarian, he made a Bob Dylan documentary.
I forgot that. Oh my gosh. Oh, that movie's awesome too. Jeez.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a fun watch. But I think out of the ones that I watched to prepare for this retrospective, After Hours was the one that stood out to me. So go see After Hours. It's
for sure.
Yeah, it's worth the watch.
Would you like to hear my theory about the Bob Dylan
documentary? Tell me.
So, and this goes back to our Herzog talk. He came out with a masterclass online at the same time as Werner Herzog, and I'm sure he's seen Werner Herzog movies before, but I watched both of those and kind of tried to do some of the activities, and Herzog, his whole philosophy is like to create documentaries that are fake, because he's like trying to get to the real truth. And I wonder if Scorsese watched that masterclass, because right after that, he made that documentary about Bob Dylan, which is so fake.
Interesting.
And the beginning has this magician, and it's just supposed to be like, we're going to make everything up. Like,
yeah.
We're going to have Sharon Stone in it, and we're going to have like a fake politician guy. Yeah. But it's great. I mean,
that's a good theory.
Yeah.
So,
but that's my theory.
Check it out. It's on Netflix. So
yeah.
So yep.
After Hours, Rolling Thunder, Bob Dylan, and rewatch Goodfellas, guys.
Yeah, rewatch Goodfellas. Watch his entire filmography. There's not a bad one in there. So
yeah, all worth watching.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, that concludes another episode of Movie Mood. Talking Scorsese. Who are we going to talk about next time, John?
Ooh, what are you thinking? Well, Mank was just released on Netflix.
Right.
We could talk about Fincher.
That's true.
What do you think?
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Yeah.
We could talk Fincher. We could talk Spielberg.
We could talk
Al Pacino.
Herman Mankiewicz.
Yeah. I'm not as familiar with his work.
No. We'll keep you posted.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, cool.
Cool.
Later.